Hello and welcome to Therapy Cable. I'm Dr. Ehsan Garajadaki, clinical psychologist. Today we will be talking about how to treat personality disorders. We have created a few videos on the definition of personality disorders and mostly where they come from, the etiology, more or less, the root causes, and the symptomatology. Now, these videos are going to be mostly about the treatment of personality disorder. So just like we did before in terms of going through the clusters, there are three clusters of personality disorders according to DSM-5. That's the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual that's published by APA, American Psychological Association. And so the clusters are A, B, and C. A is the odd eccentric cluster, B is the dramatic emotional cluster, C is the fearful anxious cluster. And we're going to go through them, not the clusters and the description, definition, but actually according to that order and talk about the treatment. So cluster A includes paranoid, schizotypal, and schizoid personality disorder. So we will go through those one by one. So in order to really address treatment for the first category, which is paranoid personality disorder, let's talk a little bit first of all about when I would say to treat them, because especially as part of the characteristic of being paranoid, people who may have such traits or characteristics or full-blown disorder, they may not even show up to therapy. They really do have an inclination and disinclination toward therapists or therapy. They're suspicious and quite doubtful and really on guard in terms of whether or not the therapist could help them or whether or not they would have ulterior motives, whether or not they would be actually in danger, because again that's part of that paranoid characteristic that a person with paranoid personality disorder is struggling with on a daily basis. They have paranoia. They're paranoid around all their interactions with everybody, including family members and close friends, let alone someone they haven't met, a specialist, so to say, who may hold a certain power over them. So they're very wary about giving up this power or trust, entering in that relationship. So that's really the idea of when, because if we don't even get them to come to treatment, there's no treatment, right? So, so the first, kind of prerogative that we want to keep in mind is how to get them into therapy, because usually they're just disinclined to come to therapy. So generally what you see, I would say, are two, if you will, subgroups. One would be a more or less, I would say, kind of a captive audience, like people who may be incarcerated, and that's why they're available. Otherwise, they would, if people have freedom to be wherever they want to be, they're not going to be at the therapist's office. But if they are in a prison system, they're in a more or less confined environment that legally allows people to confine them, and they're supposed to face a therapist as part of their, let's say, sentence or daily schedule or weekly schedule, then okay, then we're have the opportunity of seeing this kind of subgroup of individuals who are more or less forced to go to therapy or see a clinician. And then the other subgroup being the people with paranoid personality disorder who, one way or another, maybe due to a greater insight, maybe to a greater attachment or a deeper connection and trust with one person, at least in their lives, have come to believe that there is some hope or some opportunity that they ultimately can kind of convince themselves to go through with therapy, maybe for the sake of their relationship, or, and again, just kind of an overriding factor that even though generally they're suspicious of everything and relationships and everybody. However, it's probably worth it to them to go to see a clinician or therapist, a trusted person, to just maybe save this type of relationship that they're in. Maybe they have been convinced by a spouse or a family member that they're trusting, such as a child or a parent, to just go seek some counseling, some limited form of help. So that would be a different group because they are voluntarily coming in and their predisposition is different toward that therapeutic relationship. So again, so as you can see that, when we talk about treatment is not a blanket kind of a model that can be applied to everybody regardless of their situation. So we have to actually take into consideration the circumstances in which the person is coming in to therapy or even being forced to take therapy. Now, generally, we don't really believe in terms of a forced treatment, a forced therapy, unless really we're talking about somebody who is completely dysfunctional and self-damaging to a point where if we don't help them, they damage themselves even more, such as, extreme cases with, let's say, I would say, developmental disorders, such as autistic, at times a very severely autistic child who is self-harming, and if we just leave them alone and don't provide them with the appropriate treatment, even though they don't like to get the treatment, then it makes the case worse. There are many basically developmentally challenged autistic kids who bang their heads against the wall or self-harm. So we would have to come to their help. Or people with schizophrenia who may be highly delusional and hallucinating, and basically the reality testing is completely shot and they may harm themselves or others. And at times you would have to medicate them, restrain them, again for their for their own good, if you will, and the good for the community and maybe close family members or people around in their surroundings. So, but when it comes to that subgroup of people with paranoid personality disorder who are incarcerated, and if we want to force therapy on them, that by itself also is really a fine line to tread. And that's something that I would bring up because as a clinician, let's say if a person is working in the prison system and they're assigned to a prisoner, to an inmate, more or less, somebody who is maybe has had history of paranoid personality disorder or is being diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder, it is incumbent upon that clinician and even the environment to make that transition, that process of providing therapy, really a pleasant one rather than a forceful one. So, and with that in mind, a clinician, a highly competent clinician, would really have certain safeguards, certain ways of really establishing rapport from get-go to the point that the benefits of therapy and these therapeutic relationships are highlighted very much from the beginning, and a lot of time is spent on establishing trust and rapport and connection and that attachment, and almost like proving oneself, like the clinician proving oneself that let me prove to you that I'm not here to get you, I'm not here to have alternative motives and maybe even make your case worse or provide some kind of evidence against you, anything like that. But it is really, meant as a psychological help, mental health, mental support, and create that equal, if you will, as much as possible, equal relationship, at least between the clinician and the client. In order to invite some kind of a volunteer investment of time, energy, emotional, psychic, cognitive energy from the client, so that it actually starts working, rather than the client or the inmate, prisoner feeling, well, this is being forced upon me. I don't believe anybody anyways, and I'm doubtful of anyone who is coming talking to me, even especially a clinician. They can play mind tricks or mind games and stuff like that. Then it's not going to work. So why would we want to even attempt treatment if we know that the outcome is very much negative, or the likelihood of benefit is very, very low? So again, when we say part of treatment, it's not like a fast track to just applying a certain model immediately and then the client is going to get better. When we say treatment really is a very kind of fully encompassing a very comprehensive process from very much beginning of assessment. It includes the very few first stages of clinical assessment and communication with a client, all the way to more or less a thorough methodical implementation of certain therapeutic models and modalities and then continued assessment and evaluation based on the feedback that is being received from the client, all the way to perhaps the phase of wrapping up termination aftercare. So the treatment really is the whole thing. It's not just the middle part of it that, let's say, a CBT approach is being implemented. So with the paranoid personality disorder, that's why I'm kind of spending so much time explaining this, because again, the understanding of this paranoid personality disorder is crucial to implementing every single step and phase of treatment from beginning to end, which includes a focused and a very meticulous type of an approach toward spending enough time in the beginning to establish rapport, to gain trust, to really prove oneself or prove that this relationship is a reliable, trustworthy relationship that actually provides more benefits than any perceived harm. So after that phase is done, really, and also to I would say, a lighter version, the same principle applies to that other subgroup where a person voluntarily comes into therapy. Again, a lot of time has to be spent on really gaining the investment, the time and emotional investment of and the trust of the client in believing that there is an equal power, equal relationship, equal say, that the client has control and is kind of a co-director, a co-pilot of this whole process. Once that is done, I would say equally for both groups, the idea here is to, again, help the client rather than, let's say, provoke them and dispute their irrational beliefs or kind of get in their face and more or less prove them wrong. That's the wrong approach. What we want to do, the idea is really to to help the client help themselves, to help the client, kind of dissect the this internal struggle and understand that there is part of them that is actually quite functional and able to more or less step outside a little bit and have some self-examination versus that the other part that is continually suspicious of relationships and understand why that exists. The core element here to help a person with paranoid personality is to really allow them to see that this suspicious side of them actually has been to a greater extent beneficial in their lives, and it has helped them to protect themselves, but that it has more or less taken over, the complete control, and to some extent even basically exaggerated, out of control fashion, where to a point that continual reliance and preoccupation with suspicion about everything becomes quite debilitating and has negative impact and negative effects. So if we can help a person kind of navigate, even though really that's the difficulty. Their difficulty is to be able to navigate what's true, what's not true, what's fact, what is fantasy, what is a very good reason to suspect someone, and basically it's factual and very much realistic versus a not so realistic and non-factual, perhaps irrational reason to try to suspect someone and a person's intention. So uh, navigating that territory to help a person to even perhaps go back to history to establish a more or less inventory of the times that they have been able to discern between these good and bad reasons, these appropriate and inappropriate situations of examination, of judgment, and be able for themselves to perhaps make that list that if I engage in these very limited set of examination, criticism, suspicion about others, and I can corroborate that with some kind of a third party evidence, if you will, and and have proof more or less in my own for my own self that it is reliable, that I can see ultimately it turns out to my benefit, meaning down the road it is providing some opportunities for success, for self-care, for advancement, for growth, versus another list of perhaps exaggerated, extreme levels of suspicion and examination and criticism of self and others to a point of really kind of getting lost within this jungle and not having any type of an anchor to rely on and to ground oneself, and then ultimately having suffered the consequences that have been harming to oneself and others, then hopefully there is that, let's say, heightened awareness that can become a skill that can be trained, that can be improved and mastered, if you will. We can help a client to achieve a level of higher, advanced, accelerated level of implementation of this discernment within their own life and be able to walk their way out of this depth of paranoia, if you will. And the other aspect I would bring up is the concept of family support. Everyone, unless a person is completely isolated, even a person with high paranoid personality disorder has more or less some attachment to some people, some connection to one or two people in their lives that they may be just kind of much more attached to and trusting. And if that is the case, then what we can do is enrich that, strengthen that, help the client to reach out to that person and have that person also be involved in the whole process and treatment to strengthen their relationship and kind of get this support from multiple people to help the person to overcome the issue with paranoid personality. This is the first part and the category of paranoid personality that we discussed. Now let's move on to the second one, which is the schizoid personality disorder or schizoid personality disorder. And again, when it comes to treatment of schizoid, quickly what we have to understand is that kind of a review of etiology in a few sentences, which we know has to do with the lack of desire of connecting with others, as well as, so basically is more or less some kind of an odd, eccentric presentation, as they have really not been around by many people. There is no desire to be around many people, and if they are around people, then there is a certain awkwardness about the social script that they're engaging in, the interpersonal effectiveness that they're engaging in. So knowing that with the schizoid personality, what we need to keep in mind is that really kind of encouraging more and more and more of, if you will, like a call for reconnection with the society and others is not really very helpful, because there is again no desire. we can't necessarily increase desire in a person. What we could do is really focus on more of social skills development and social skills building for those few and sporadic times when a person with schizoid personality is finds himself or herself in a social environment. So more or less, if you will, damage control and increasing their level of competence for the times that they may have to interact with others in their environment. So knowing what to say, knowing what to do. And again, the same problem exists with this group, that mostly people with schizoid personality disorder, they don't voluntarily come to seek therapy, right? Because they don't, again, desire human connection or social connection. So they rather just isolate themselves and remain in their own, peculiar world, if you will, and kind of remain preoccupied with things that just interest them and may not interest anybody else around them. So the idea here would be knowing this particular predicament that we may not even see them often. So if we do see them in therapy, again, maybe based on some kind of, perhaps they have been prodded by some family members or somebody close to them to come to seek therapy, or again, they have been perhaps court ordered or as part of a certain requirement. They are again part of probation, maybe they have been required to seek therapy. Then ultimately understand that we can't necessarily increase their desire and wanting connection with people, but what we can help them is with increasing social, interactional, interpersonal competence to know, how to read better social cues in other people, interpret them more appropriately, to be able to match those social cues and what we call social script, to kind of have a script, have a program, have an understanding, like a predetermined plan or map for them to know what to say, how to act, how to behave, how to interact with others. Such as, if a person, maybe, let's say they hold a job, even though they have schizoid personality, but because they hold a job and they have an understanding of the necessity for them to keep their job, we can help them with more or less scripting their way and the whole day of interactions, very much structured way of starting their work, taking care of their obligations, knowing how to deal with certain demands and expectations of their supervisors and co-workers, knowing how to deflect and kind of cordially, professionally deal with surprising elements that they may not be ready for, such as, somebody barging into their office or some kind of a surprise event that is being put together, or like an emergency request from someone. Being prepared for those unexpected intrusions, if you will, that can help them have that script to know what to say, how to act, how to interact, how to respond, and then kind of end their day throughout the day, and then in their job, and then kind of go home and really maybe then have that solace or isolation or peacefulness where they can just attend to their own needs without having to interact with anybody else, and kind of cherish that, like recharge, energize, and be able to get back on track for the next day. Then moving forward to the third category, which is the schizotypal personality disorder. Here, the distinction is that the person with schizotypal personality traits, characteristics, they do have desire to interact with others. They don't want to isolate themselves, but they have, odd, irrational, very peculiar, unusual thoughts, beliefs, as well as, engage in certain behaviors that are sporadic, very unusual, very infrequent in the society. And again, they have certain delusions or hallucinations, very minor ones or light ones, but still something that is not common, and therefore it impacts them, and they act awkwardly in interactions with people. And Now here we could do both. Not only can we work on social skills and increasing their level of aptitude in terms of how to respond to people, how to navigate their way around this awkwardness or awkward social situations, and perhaps be prepared to have like a canned approach and response that they come to their mind to de-escalate, if you will, and kind of normalize the situation, but also increase their work on their desire, because they do desire to work with people, to interact with people. Use that as an advantage, use that as an ally in kind of appeal to their sense of the benefit that they would get from attaching to others, creating bonds, enriching their relationships with others that would be ultimately very beneficial to them, and use that as a motivation to help them go through the hardship that they would have to endure in navigating the social realm of interaction and interacting and engaging with other people in social settings. Because certainly they would have to put some effort, or they may have to, let's say, rehearse certain or kind of practice certain social interactional scripts. And if that's the case, there's a lot of effort that they have to put in there. And based on that, at least what they can do is reach back into their level of motivation and remind themselves that this is why I'm doing all this, because ultimately it is beneficial to me. I will be able to get along better with people and have better relationships. Things are going to work out for me. So that was the really summary of the three categories: paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders, part of cluster A. And next time what we will do is go through treatment for other clusters, cluster B and then cluster C. So for now, I would like to thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments, please do feel free to leave a comment for us. If you have any other ideas, would like us to produce any other videos on other personality issues or psychological concepts that you're interested in and curious about, please let us know. Leave us a comment. Thank you very much for for watching Therapy Cable and our videos. We appreciate your comments and your interaction. Leave us a comment. We look forward to reading them and responding to you. Have a wonderful day.